Can the Reverend be that good? People often ask this question when reading Lila because the Reverend comes across as impossibly good. How can any human being be this kind, this compassionate, this good, right? You can't really trust it. Anyone who's that good has to be after something or be playing at something. I mean, look at page 25. Lila, he said, I'm glad to know you aren't planning to leave. But if you ever change your mind, I want you to leave by daylight. I want you to have a train ticket in your hand that will take you right where you want to go. And I want you to take your ring and anything else I have given you. You might want to sell it. That would be all right. It's yours, not mine. It doesn't belong here. I mean, it wouldn't. He cleared his throat. You're my wife, he said. I want to take care of you, even if that means someday seeing you to the train. He leaned forward and looked into her face almost sternly, so she would know he meant what he said. Who does that? Who tells their wife, their dearly beloved wife, that if you want to leave, it's okay, but do it by the daylight so that I can be sure you have a train ticket because I want to take care of you even in your leaving me? What sort of goodness is this? Who would say such a thing? What does that sort of goodness and freedom do? Freedom for Lila, that is, right? She leaves because she wants to leave if she chooses to leave. And she doesn't have to do it secretly or shamedly. Can anyone be that good? Or how about in the marriage proposal? Page 80 and 81, they're talking about the grave and the roses that she's cultivated around the grave of his first wife and child who died at birth. And Lila hears herself saying, "You ought to marry me." He stopped still, and she hurried away to the other side of the road, the flush of shame and anger so hot in her that this time surely she could not go on living. When he caught up with her, when he touched her sleeve, she could not look at him. "Yes," he said, "you're right, I will." She said, "All right, then I'll see you tomorrow." Why did she say that? What was she planning on doing tomorrow? He just stood there. She could feel him watching her. Of all the crazy things she had ever done, it was that feeling that she had had walking along beside him that put the notion in her mind. It comes from being alone too much. Things matter that wouldn't if you had a regular life. Just walking along beside that old man, past the edge of town, not even talking most of the time, with the cottonwoods shining and rustling and shading the road. She never really looked at him, but he was beautiful, gentle and solid. His voice so mild when he spoke, his hair so silvery white. If she ever thought of herself marrying anybody, it would have been a man who was young enough not to mind a day's work. Being a preacher was a kind of work, though. And he had that house to live in, gardens around it, gone to weed. It's the strangest marriage proposal. Out of the blue, she asks him to marry her. Completely unexpectedly, they hardly know each other. She's a homeless woman sleeping in a shack at the edge of town. And he says yes. And what's more, he seems to mean it. When they're talking about it a few days later, because of course she's been avoiding him for a while, he asks her, "So, are we getting married or not?" He's the one who brings it up. And she said, "If you want to, it's all right with me, I suppose. But I can't see how it's going to work." He nodded. "There could be problems. I've thought about that quite a lot." "What if it turns out I'm crazy? What if I got the law after me? All you know about me is what anybody can tell by looking, and nobody else ever wanted to marry me." He shrugged. "I guess you don't know me very well either. It ain't the same. Somebody like me might marry somebody like you just because you've got a good house, and winter's coming. Just because she's tired of the damn loneliness. Somebody like you got no reason at all to marry somebody like me." He shrugged. I was getting along with the damned loneliness well enough. I expected to continue with it the rest of my life. Then I saw you that morning. I saw your face. And a little bit later, in the same conversation, he realizes that he doesn't have much to offer her. He says, "You have to understand, I have given this a great deal of thought. What an old country preacher might have to give a young woman like you. Not the things a man her age could give her, a worldlier man. So I would be grateful for anything I could give you. Maybe comfort or peace or safety. For a while at least. I am old." He tells her to leave by daylight after they're married. He accepts her proposal and then brings it up again and recognizes that he has nothing to offer her. On page 184, a little later, he calls forth her story. He tells her they're getting ready for lunch. He knows something's upsetting her. He made his voice as gentle as he could. "Lila, I know I've said this any number of times, but people do talk to me about all sorts of things. Sometimes it helps. At least that's what they tell me." She said, "Then for the rest of their life, you're going to think about it every time you look at them, hear their name even." "True." "Well, I suppose it would have to be true, wouldn't it? The worse it was, the more you'd remember." "Maybe I don't want you looking at me that way." "Fine," he said, "whatever you say. I don't know how people go on living in the same town with you." "A few of them do leave the church. Maybe because they've told me more than they meant to. I've suspected that was part of it in some cases." She said, "Now you're looking at me, probably thinking it's worse than it is. Maybe it couldn't even be no worse." And then she does go on to tell him her story. And he goes on to receive it in exactly the way we would expect the Reverend to at this point, with graciousness and compassion, and in a way that seems to make her story a gift to him. Her story of shame and of being unwanted, her story of longing and sadness. He receives all of that as if it is somehow a gift to him. Can anyone be this good? I think one of the challenging things is that in our world, few people are very good. And sometimes when we see so much goodness, we get suspicious and afraid and we push it away. And that does two things. Number one, I think it blinds us in really horrible ways, maybe like Lila, but worse, right? Because Lila, while she doesn't trust the Reverend, she keeps going back. She keeps trying to figure it out, right? Sometimes we just run away. The other thing, though, is I think it makes us unaware of the nuances of what's going on in another person. The Reverend is very good, but he isn't perfect. And if you pay attention, you'll see that in the story. He wrestles with anger. He is also sometimes suspicious of her. He wants to protect her in ways that would be demeaning or that could turn into a sort of pity or a sort of that sort of manipulative paternalism. And you can see him resisting that temptation, but it is there and it is strong in him. So keep your eye out for that. Don't let his profound goodness wash away all of the interesting contours and nuances of his character and his story. He is a man who has suffered a lot. He is also a man who is imperfect. He is a man who is capable of anger. He is a man who is capable of the sort of demeaning pity that Lila is afraid of. But he fights it. He gives it over in prayer all of the time. And somehow when he does that in this novel, it's actually a beautiful thing. All that said, he is a very, very good person. He's a beautiful human being. He is an image of a life well lived. So even though we can see that he isn't perfect, with all of the goodness that there is, I think a really good question to ask ourselves as we read this is, are you afraid to trust the Reverend's goodness? Because in asking that question, what we're also asking is, are you afraid to trust God's goodness? And if so, why?